It was Thanksgiving night, the kind of night meant for family, laughter, and gratitude. Instead, I sat frozen in the dining room, heart-shattering in a way I never imagined possible. My own son's whispered words, "Mom's too old to notice we took a loan on her name," cut through the hum of conversations and clinking silverware like a dagger. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I'm Rose Millicent Hartwell, 72 years old, and I've been living in this cramped two-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York, for the past 15 years. The building dates back to the 1960s, with paper-thin walls that let in every sound from the street below. Car horns blare at all hours, distant sirens wail through the night, and the subway rumbles beneath us like a restless beast. But inside these four walls, there's a heavier sound, the silence where love should be. That Thanksgiving evening started like any other holiday gathering. I had spent 3 days preparing everything from scratch, just like my mother taught me back in Ohio. The turkey was golden brown, the stuffing perfectly seasoned with sage and thyme, and the pumpkin pie cooling on my kitchen counter still carried the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg. My hands, weathered from decades of work, had lovingly crafted every dish. I wore my best dress, a navy blue one with tiny white flowers that I'd saved for special occasions. It was getting loose on my frame, but I'd pinned it carefully to hide how much weight I'd lost from the stress of the past few months. My silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and I'd even put on the pearl earrings my husband had given me 30 years ago for our anniversary. The dining room table, which usually seated just me, was crowded with my family. My son Michael sat at the head, all 45 years of him dressed in an expensive suit that I knew I'd helped pay for. His wife Sandra picked at her food, scrolling through her phone between bites. Their teenage daughter Emma barely looked up from her own device. My daughter Jennifer sat across from me with her new boyfriend, a man I'd met only twice but who seemed more interested in our family's financial conversations than our family stories. That's when I heard it. Michael leaning over to Sandra, his voice low but not low enough. "Mom's too old to notice we took a loan on her name. The business needs the capital, and honestly, she'll never understand the paperwork anyway." The words hit me like physical blows. My fork clattered against my plate, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to spin. The candles I'd lit flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows across faces that suddenly looked foreign to me. These were my children, my family, the people I'd sacrificed everything for. And they were discussing my financial ruin like it was nothing more than passing the salt. I excused myself to the kitchen, my legs unsteady beneath me. The familiar space felt different now, smaller, more suffocating. I leaned against the counter where I'd kneaded countless loaves of bread, where I'd packed school lunches for decades, where I'd written check after check to help my family through their various crises. Through the thin wall, I could hear them continuing their conversation, their voices more relaxed now that they thought I was out of earshot. Michael was explaining his new business venture, something about importing electronics from overseas. Sandra was worried about the risk, but Jennifer was encouraging him, saying our family had always been smart with investments. Smart with investments. If only they knew the truth about my finances. Let me take you back to where this all began, because my story isn't a sudden tragedy. It's a lifetime of sacrifices that nobody ever acknowledged, a slow erosion of my dignity that happened so gradually I didn't even notice it myself. I moved to New York in 1975 with my husband Robert, fresh-faced and full of dreams. We found this little apartment in Queens, and back then, it felt like a palace. The neighborhood was different, families with kids playing stickball in the streets, neighbors who knew each other's names and looked out for each other's children. Robert worked construction, good honest work that left him tired but proud at the end of each day. I took a job at the local elementary school, first as a teacher's aide and eventually working my way up to the main office. The pay wasn't much, but between the two of us, we managed. We were happy then, or at least I thought we were. Michael was born in 1978, a beautiful baby with his father's dark hair and my green eyes. Jennifer followed 3 years later, a tiny bundle of energy who never sat still. I remember those early years with such clarity, the smell of baby powder mixing with Robert's coffee in the morning, the sound of small feet running across our hardwood floors, the way the afternoon sun would stream through our living room window and illuminate their toys scattered across the carpet. I gave up my dreams of going back to school, of maybe becoming a real teacher someday. The children needed me, and Robert's income alone wasn't enough to cover childcare and rent in the city. So I adjusted. I stayed home when they were small, took on evening cleaning jobs when they started school, did whatever it took to keep our family afloat. The first real test came in 1995. Robert hurt his back on a construction site, a herniated disc that required surgery and months of physical therapy. Workers' compensation covered some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough. I remember sitting at this very kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills and insurance forms, trying to figure out how we were going to survive. That's when I took the night shift cleaning offices in Manhattan. 3 nights a week, I'd ride the subway into the city after dinner, spend 8 hours mopping floors and emptying trash cans in gleaming corporate buildings where people made more money in a day than I saw in a month. The smell of industrial disinfectant would cling to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I'd come home as the sun was rising, grab a few hours of sleep, then get up to make breakfast for the kids before they went to school. I did this for 2 years until Robert's back healed enough for him to return to lighter work. Michael was 17 then, Jennifer 14. They never said thank you. They never even seemed to notice that their mother was slowly disappearing, becoming nothing more than a tired shadow moving through their lives, making sure their needs were met while ignoring her own. When Michael graduated high school, he wanted to go to college. Not just any college, he had his heart set on a private school upstate, a place that cost more per semester than I used to make in a year. Robert and I didn't have that kind of money saved. College wasn't something we'd planned for, not really. We figured the kids would go to community college, maybe transfer to a state school if they wanted to continue. But Michael was insistent. This school had the business program he wanted. This was his future we were talking about. How could we deny him his dreams? So I went back to work. Full-time at the school during the day, cleaning offices 3 nights a week, and taking on weekend catering jobs when I could find them. I was 54 years old, my joints ached constantly, and I was so tired I sometimes fell asleep standing up at the bathroom sink. But I did it. I paid for his tuition, his room and board, his textbooks, even his spending money so he wouldn't have to work while he was studying. For years of this. For years of watching every penny, of wearing the same clothes until they fell apart, of eating beans and rice for dinner so I could send him money for pizza with his friends. He graduated with a business degree and not a penny of student debt. Did he thank me? Did he acknowledge the sacrifice? The night he graduated, he called home drunk from a party. "Thanks for the money, Mom," he slurred into the phone. "I promise I'll pay you back someday." Someday never came. Jennifer was different, or so I thought. She was gentler, more aware of others' feelings. When she graduated high school 2 years later, she chose a community college nearby. She said she wanted to stay close to home, wanted to help take care of us as we got older. I was so grateful, so relieved to have at least one child who seemed to understand the value of family. But Jennifer had her own struggles. She fell in love with a boy from school, got pregnant at 19, married him in a small ceremony that I paid for. The marriage lasted 3 years and produced my beautiful granddaughter Sophie, who became the light of my life. When Jennifer's marriage fell apart, she moved back home with Sophie, and I welcomed them with open arms. More mouths to feed, more bodies to house in our already cramped apartment. Sophie slept in what had been my sewing room, Jennifer took the couch, and I squeezed an extra bed into our bedroom for the times when she needed her own space. It wasn't ideal, but it was family. That's what you do for family. Jennifer got a job at a local restaurant, but childcare was expensive and her schedule was unpredictable. So I became Sophie's primary caregiver. I'd pick her up from school, help her with homework, make her dinner, read her bedtime stories. On weekends when Jennifer worked double shifts, Sophie and I would spend the whole day together, visiting parks, going to the library, building pillow forts in the living room. I loved that little girl with every fiber of my being. She called me Grandma Rose, and when she wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and whispered, "I love you," in my ear, it made all the sacrifices feel worthwhile. She was the reason I kept going, the bright spot in an increasingly difficult life. By 2008, both kids were supposedly on their feet. Michael had started his own business, something involving computer repairs and website design. Jennifer had found a new apartment and a better job. I thought maybe, finally, I could start thinking about retirement. I was 65, my body was worn down from decades of physical labor, and Robert's health was declining. His back problems had worsened over the years, and he'd developed diabetes that was becoming harder to manage. Then the recession hit. Michael's business collapsed almost overnight. Companies stopped spending money on websites, people held on to their old computers longer, and his client base evaporated. He came to me with tears in his eyes, saying he was going to lose everything, his apartment, his car, his girlfriend. Could I help him out, just until things turned around? What mother could say no to that? I took out a second mortgage on our apartment. The interest rates were terrible, the monthly payments stretched our budget to the breaking point, but I did it. I gave Michael $20,000 to keep his business afloat. 6 months later, he needed more. Then more again. Each time, he promised it was the last time, that things were turning around, that he was on the verge of landing a big contract that would solve everything. Jennifer, meanwhile, was struggling too. The restaurant where she worked cut her hours, and she couldn't make rent on her new apartment. Could she move back home, just temporarily? Could I help with Sophie's school clothes, her field trip fees, her birthday party? Of course I could. Of course I would. What grandmother wouldn't? By 2010, I was working more hours than ever just to keep us all afloat. I took a part-time job in addition to my position at the school. I cleaned houses on weekends. I sold my grandmother's jewelry, my mother's china, anything of value I could find. Robert was too sick to work regularly, so everything fell on my shoulders. I remember one particularly dark day in November of that year. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills I couldn't pay, holding a notice from the bank that we were 3 months behind on our mortgage. My hands were shaking as I tried to do the math, tried to figure out how to stretch our money far enough to cover everything. Michael called while I was sitting there, panic in his voice. His business was finally turning around, he said, but he needed just $5,000 more to buy some equipment that would secure a major contract. I don't have it, I whispered into the phone. What do you mean you don't have it? His voice turned sharp, accusatory. Mom, this is my future we're talking about. Can't you take out another loan or something? Another loan. As if I hadn't already mortgaged my entire future for his dreams. But I did it. I went to one of those predatory lending places, the kind with neon signs and interest rates that should be criminal. I borrowed $5,000 at 30% interest, using my car as collateral. Michael never got that contract. The pattern continued for years. Crisis after crisis, emergency after emergency. Sophie needed dental work that Jennifer's insurance wouldn't cover. Michael's girlfriend left him and he needed money for a new apartment. Jennifer's car broke down and she couldn't get to work without it. Robert needed medications that Medicare wouldn't approve. Each time, I found the money somewhere. I borrowed against my pension. I took out credit cards with those introductory 0% offers, then scrambled to pay them off before the rates jumped. I sold everything I owned that had any value. My mother's engagement ring. My father's watch. The antique desk that had been in our family for generations. I told myself it was temporary. Things would get better. My children would get back on their feet and start helping me instead of asking for help. Robert's health would improve. I would find a way to retire with dignity. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I was starting to understand the truth. I wasn't a beloved mother and grandmother. I was a bank. A source of funds that never ran dry, no matter how often they came to make withdrawals. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept up on me slowly, like water seeping through a crack in the foundation. Little things at first. The way Michael's voice changed when I said I couldn't afford something, going from loving and grateful to cold and distant. The way Jennifer would suddenly remember she had somewhere else to be when I mentioned that I was feeling lonely or overwhelmed. I started noticing that our conversations always centered around their problems, their needs, their crises. When was the last time one of them had asked how I was doing? When was the last time they'd shown any interest in my life beyond my ability to solve their financial problems? The worst part was the way they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. I have good hearing for my age, better than they realized. I heard Michael on the phone with his friends, complaining about having to visit the old lady for Sunday dinner. I heard Jennifer telling someone that I was getting weird about money, as if wanting to understand where my savings had gone was some kind of character flaw. They started making comments about my age, my memory, my ability to understand complex situations. Mom, don't worry about the details, they'd say when I asked questions about the loans I was co-signing or the checks I was writing. You wouldn't understand anyway. Just trust us. Trust them. The two people who had systematically drained my life savings, who had mortgaged my future, who had taken advantage of my love for their own gain. Trust them. But I did. Because they were my children, and that's what mothers do. We trust. We sacrifice. We give until there's nothing left to give, and then we find a way to give more. Robert died in the spring of 2018. A heart attack at the age of 74, quick and relatively painless, the doctors said. One moment he was watching television in his recliner, the next he was gone. I found him there when I came home from grocery shopping, still holding the remote, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for years. The funeral was expensive. Michael and Jennifer both insisted on a proper service, with flowers and catering and a reception afterward. They promised to help with the costs, but somehow the bills all ended up on my doorstep. The funeral home, the cemetery, the church, the restaurant where we held the luncheon, everything came to nearly $15,000, money I didn't have. I was now alone, a widow living on Social Security and a modest pension from the school district. My monthly income was barely enough to cover rent and utilities, let alone food and medical expenses. But the kids still needed help. Michael's business was expanding, he said, and he needed capital to take it to the next level. Jennifer was going back to school to get a nursing degree, and education was expensive. It's an investment in our future, Mom, Jennifer would say, her voice sweet and persuasive. Once I'm a nurse, I'll be able to take care of you properly. I'll be able to pay you back everything you've given me. Everything I'd given them. As if it was a gift freely given, rather than a systematic draining of my resources. I was 70 by then, my body failing in small but noticeable ways. My knees ached when I climbed the stairs to our second-floor apartment. My hands cramped when I wrote checks. My eyes needed stronger glasses to read the fine print on loan documents and credit card applications. But I kept giving. What choice did I have? These were my children, my only family. If I didn't help them, who would? And if I stopped helping them, would they still want me in their lives? That fear, the fear of abandonment, of being truly alone in the world, was stronger than my growing resentment of their demands. It was stronger than my exhaustion, stronger than my financial desperation, stronger than the little voice in my head that whispered this wasn't normal, this wasn't right. I started having dreams about my mother during this period. She'd been dead for 20 years, but suddenly she was visiting me in my sleep, sitting at my kitchen table in her favorite blue dress, shaking her head sadly. "Rose, honey," she would say in that gentle voice I remembered so well. "You're giving away pieces of yourself until there won't be anything left. What are you going to do when the well runs dry?" I would wake from these dreams with tears on my cheeks, but I didn't know how to stop. Didn't know how to say no. Didn't know how to be anything other than what I'd always been, the giver, the helper, the one who fixed everyone else's problems. The beginning of the end came last summer. I was hospitalized with pneumonia, a consequence of working too hard and not taking care of myself properly. I spent 5 days in the hospital, most of it alone. Michael visited once, staying just long enough to ask if I'd remembered to pay his car insurance before I got sick. Jennifer came by twice, both times with Sophie, who was now 15 and more interested in her phone than in spending time with her grandmother. My neighbor Judy, a woman I barely knew beyond polite hallway greetings, brought me soup when I got home. She sat with me for an hour, asking nothing, expecting nothing, just being present in a way my own children hadn't been in years. "Honey," she said as she was leaving, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you look exhausted. Not sick exhausted, soul exhausted. When's the last time you did something just for you?" I couldn't answer her. I couldn't remember. That night, as I lay in my empty bed listening to the sounds of the city outside my window, I started adding up the numbers in my head. How much had I given them over the years? How much of my future had I sacrificed for their present? The next morning, I forced myself to go through my financial records. Bank statements, loan documents, credit card bills, receipts, everything I could find. I spread it all out on my dining room table and began to calculate. The number was staggering. Over the past 10 years alone, I had given my children more than $100,000. My entire life savings, gone. My retirement security, destroyed. My financial future, mortgaged to pay for their mistakes and their dreams. But the worst discovery was yet to come. A few weeks later, while looking for a receipt to dispute a charge on my electric bill, I found something that made my blood run cold. Official documents, hidden in a folder in Michael's old bedroom, showing that he had taken out a loan using my name and credit history. $30,000, borrowed against the value of my apartment, without my knowledge or consent. My hands shook as I read through the paperwork. My signature was there, but it wasn't my signature. Someone had forged it, badly but apparently well enough to fool the loan officers. The money had been deposited into Michael's business account 6 months ago. That's when I knew. That's when the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. They weren't just taking advantage of my generosity, they were stealing from me. Committing fraud. Using my love for them as a weapon against me. I sat in my kitchen that evening, the forged documents spread in front of me, and for the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my anger. Not the gentle disappointment I'd trained myself to feel when they let me down, but pure, righteous fury. They had stolen from me. They had lied to me. They had systematically destroyed my financial security while acting like they were doing me favors by letting me help them. I thought about calling the police. I thought about calling a lawyer. I thought about confronting them immediately, demanding explanations, insisting on restitution. But I also thought about Sophie, now 15 and caught in the middle of this dysfunction. I thought about the family gatherings that would end forever if I pressed charges. I thought about dying alone, with no one to remember me or mourn my passing. So I decided to wait. To watch. To see if maybe, just maybe, there was some explanation that would make this bearable. That's how I found myself at Thanksgiving dinner, wearing my best dress and serving food I could barely afford, listening to my son casually discuss the financial crime he had committed against me. "Mom's too old to notice we took a loan on her name." Those words cut through every rationalization I'd been making, every excuse I'd been accepting. They thought I was senile. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was so desperate for their love that I would let them destroy me and thank them for the privilege. They were wrong. I excused myself from the dinner table and walked to my bedroom, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the bed I'd shared with Robert for 30 years, the bed where I'd comforted my children during nightmares, the bed where I now spent most nights alone, worrying about bills I couldn't pay. I opened my dresser drawer and pulled out the folder containing all the evidence of their financial abuse. Loan documents, forged signatures, bank statements showing transfers I'd never authorized. Everything I needed to prove what they had done to me. For a moment, I considered putting it all back, pretending I'd never seen it, going back to the dinner table and playing the role they expected me to play. The grateful mother. The easy mark. The woman too old and too stupid to notice she was being robbed. But then I heard their voices from the dining room, laughing about something, probably planning their next move against my dwindling resources. And I realized that I had a choice to make. I could continue being their victim, or I could start being my own advocate. I chose advocacy. The next morning, while Michael and his family were sleeping off their Thanksgiving feast in my living room, I quietly gathered some things and walked 6 blocks to Judy's apartment. She welcomed me in without questions, made me coffee, and listened while I told her everything. "Oh honey," she said when I finished, tears in her own eyes. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," I whispered. "Decades, maybe. I didn't want to see it." "What do you want to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did I want to do? For 72 years, I had defined myself by what other people needed from me. What did Rose Hartwell want for herself? I wanted justice. I wanted my money back. I wanted my children to acknowledge what they had done and make amends. But more than anything, I wanted peace. I wanted to live whatever years I had left without constantly worrying about money, without being treated like a walking ATM, without having to choose between groceries and medicine because I'd given my pension check to yet another family crisis. I wanted to matter. Not as a source of funds, but as a human being worthy of love and respect. "I want to stop them," I told Judy. "I want to protect what little I have left." She nodded and handed me the phone. "Let's start with a lawyer." The attorney Judy recommended was a middle-aged woman named Carmen Rodriguez who specialized in elder financial abuse. Her office was small but tidy, filled with plants and family photos that made it feel warm and welcoming. She listened to my story without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said when I finished, "I'm sorry to tell you that what you've described is criminal fraud. Your son has committed identity theft, forgery, and elder financial abuse. These are serious crimes." "But he's my son," I whispered. "Yes, he is. And that makes it worse, not better. The law takes these crimes very seriously, especially when they're committed against elderly victims by family members." She explained my options. I could press criminal charges. I could file a civil lawsuit to recover some of the stolen money. I could seek a restraining order to prevent further financial abuse. "What I need you to understand," she said gently, "is that you don't have to do any of this alone. And you don't have to choose between protecting yourself and maintaining your family relationships. If your children truly love you, they'll want to make this right." I left her office with business cards and pamphlets, my head spinning with information about elder abuse hotlines and victims' rights. For the first time in years, I felt like I had options beyond simply enduring whatever my children chose to do to me. But I also felt terrified. What if I confronted them and they cut me out of their lives completely? What if I never saw Sophie again? What if I ended up truly alone, with no family at all? Those fears felt overwhelming as I walked home through the darkening streets of Queens. The November air was cold, and I pulled my thin coat tighter around my shoulders. I thought about my mother, who had raised 5 children during the Depression and never once complained about the sacrifices she had to make. But then I thought about my dreams, the ones where she visited me and warned me about giving away pieces of myself until nothing was left. Maybe she hadn't been warning me about generosity. Maybe she'd been warning me about self-destruction. When I got back to my apartment, Michael was waiting for me in the living room. His wife and daughter had gone back to their hotel, and Jennifer had left as well. It was just the 2 of us, mother and son, sitting in the same room where I'd rocked him to sleep as a baby. "Where were you, Mom?" "We were worried." The concern in his voice almost broke my resolve. This was my firstborn, the child I'd carried for 9 months, the baby I'd nursed and raised and loved unconditionally for 45 years. But then I thought about the forged signature on the loan documents, about the casual way he dismissed my intelligence at dinner the night before. "I was talking to a lawyer, Michael." The color drained from his face. "A lawyer? Mom, why would you need a lawyer?" I pulled the folder from my purse and set it on the coffee table between us. "Because my son has been stealing from me, and I finally have proof." He started to deny it, his voice rising in indignation. How could I accuse him of such a thing? Everything he'd done was for the family, for the business, for our future security. I was being paranoid, unreasonable, ungrateful. The word ungrateful was what did it. Ungrateful. After everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given, everything I'd lost, he had the audacity to call me ungrateful. Stop, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Just stop. I know what you did, Michael. I have the documents. I've talked to lawyers. I know my rights. The room fell silent. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across the space that suddenly felt vast despite the cramped quarters. What do you want from me? He finally asked, and there was something different in his voice now. Not the manipulative charm he usually used, but something rawer. More real. I want you to acknowledge what you've done. I want you to pay back the money you stole. I want you to start treating me like your mother instead of like your personal bank account. And if I don't? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment of truth, the moment when I had to decide whether I meant what I was saying or whether this was just another empty threat he could manipulate his way around. I thought about Sophie, about the grandson I'd never had, about the holidays we'd shared and the memories we'd made. I thought about dying alone, about having no one to call when I was sick or scared or lonely. But I also thought about the woman I'd been before I became their personal ATM. The woman who'd had dreams and goals and self-respect. The woman who deserved better than to be lied to and stolen from by her own children. If you don't, I said slowly, then I'll press charges. I'll file a civil lawsuit. I'll do whatever I have to do to protect what's left of my money and my dignity. He laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. You think you're going to sue your own son? Come on, Mom. You'd never do that. You love us too much. You're right, I said. I do love you too much. So much that I've enabled your irresponsible behavior for years. So much that I've ignored my own needs to meet your wants. So much that I've allowed you to destroy my financial security. I stood up, my joints protesting but my resolve firm. But loving you doesn't mean I have to let you destroy me. Not anymore. I walked him to the door and watched him leave, his shoulders set in anger, his jaw tight with resentment. As soon as the door closed behind him, I collapsed onto my couch and cried harder than I had since Robert's funeral. But these weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of release, of a woman finally standing up for herself after decades of being taken advantage of. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings. Carmen, my lawyer, helped me set up a new bank account that only I had access to. We changed all my passwords and security questions. We filed a police report about the forged loan documents. I also did something I'd never done before. I said no. Jennifer called Wednesday evening, her voice bright and cheerful. Sophie needed a new laptop for school, she said. Could I help out? It was only $800, and it would make such a difference in Sophie's education. I can't help you with that, Jennifer, I said. What do you mean you can't help? Is everything okay? Are you having money problems? The irony of the question almost made me laugh. Was I having money problems? Only because my children had systematically stolen everything I'd worked for my entire life. I mean, I'm not giving you any more money, I said. For laptops, for rent, for emergencies, for anything. I'm done being your personal bank. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on so long I wondered if she'd hung up. Mom, she finally said, her voice carefully controlled, I think you need to see a doctor. This doesn't sound like you at all. Maybe you're having some kind of episode. An episode. That's what she was calling my sudden outbreak of self-respect. An episode. I'm fine, Jennifer. Better than I've been in years, actually. But I'm done being taken advantage of. Taken advantage of? Mom, we're your children. We're family. Family helps each other. You're right, family does help each other. But for the past 20 years, the help has only gone in one direction. When's the last time you helped me with anything? When's the last time you even asked how I was doing? She couldn't answer that question, and we both knew it. The conversation ended badly, with Jennifer accusing me of being selfish and cruel, and me calmly pointing out that ensuring my own financial survival wasn't selfish, it was necessary. Friday brought a visit from Michael. He showed up at my door with flowers and an apology, his face arranged in the expression of wounded sincerity that had worked on me so many times before. Mom, I'm sorry about the other night. I was stressed about the business, and I said some things I didn't mean. Can we talk? I let him in, but I didn't soften. I'd seen this performance too many times before. He sat on my couch, the same couch where he'd sprawled as a teenager while I brought him snacks and helped him with homework, and launched into his prepared speech. He loved me. He appreciated everything I'd done for the family. The loan situation was a misunderstanding. He'd been planning to tell me about it, but the paperwork got complicated and he thought it would be easier to handle it himself. I was protecting you from the stress of it all, he said, his eyes wide and sincere. You're getting older, Mom, and I didn't want you to worry about the financial details. Getting older. There it was again, the implication that my age made me incompetent, that my decades of life experience somehow counted for nothing when it came to my own finances. Michael, I said when he finished his speech, do you think I'm stupid? What? No, of course not. Mom, you're the smartest woman I know. Then why do you keep treating me like I'm an idiot? Why do you keep lying to me and manipulating me and stealing from me? His mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. But then it was back, the loving son routine, the performance he'd perfected over the years. I've never stolen from you, Mom. Everything I've taken has been a loan. I always intended to pay you back. With what money, Michael? Your business has been failing for years. You haven't made a real profit since 2015. Where exactly were you planning to get the money to pay me back? He couldn't answer that either, because we both knew the truth. He'd never intended to pay me back. None of them had. They saw my money as their inheritance, something they were entitled to whether I was dead or alive. The conversation went in circles for another hour. He made promises he had no intention of keeping, offered deals that would only benefit him, tried every manipulation tactic in his considerable arsenal. But for the first time in decades, none of it worked on me. When he finally left, frustrated and angry that his usual methods had failed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: pride in myself. I had stood my ground. I had refused to be manipulated. I had chosen my own well-being over his feelings. It felt revolutionary. The holidays that followed were the loneliest of my life, but they were also the most peaceful. No frantic cooking for ungrateful relatives. No last-minute emergencies that required immediate financial intervention. No walking on eggshells, wondering what crisis would drain my bank account next. I spent Christmas morning with Judy and her family, people who barely knew me but treated me with more kindness and respect than my own children had shown me in years. Her daughter-in-law made me feel welcome at their table. Her grandchildren were polite and interested when I told them stories about old New York. No one asked me for money or made comments about my age or dismissed my opinions as irrelevant. It was the first Christmas in decades where I felt like a person instead of a checkbook. But the real test of my resolve came in January. I was sitting in my living room on a Tuesday evening, reading a book Judy had recommended, when someone started pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding, like they were trying to break it down. It was Jennifer, and she was furious. "How could you do this to us?" she screamed as soon as I opened the door. "How could you be so selfish and cruel?" I later learned that Michael had told her I was pressing charges against him, which wasn't technically true yet but wasn't entirely false either. I had filed a police report, and the investigation was ongoing. Sophie is crying herself to sleep every night because she thinks her beloved grandmother has turned into some kind of monster, Jennifer continued. She doesn't understand why you're trying to put her father in jail. The mention of Sophie hit me like a physical blow. I loved that girl with everything I had, and the thought of her being hurt by this situation was almost unbearable. But then I realized what Jennifer was doing. She was using Sophie as a weapon against me, just like she'd used her financial struggles and her single mother status and every other difficult circumstance in her life to extract money from me over the years. I'm not trying to put anyone in jail, Jennifer. I'm trying to protect myself from being financially abused by my own children. Financial abuse? Are you kidding me? We're family, Mom. Everything we've done has been because we love you and want to include you in our lives. Including me in your lives by stealing my identity and forging checks? Including me by treating me like an ATM machine with no feelings or needs of my own. She stared at me like I'd grown a second head. When did you become so bitter? When did you stop caring about your own children's happiness? When I realized that my children's happiness seemed to require my misery, I said quietly. That stopped her cold. For a moment, the anger left her face and was replaced by something that might have been shame. But it didn't last long. Fine, she said, her voice cold as winter wind. If that's how you want to be, then that's how you want to be. But don't expect to be part of our lives anymore. Don't expect to see Sophie again. Don't expect us to be there when you're old and sick and need help. Old and sick and need help. More threats, more manipulation, more attempts to control me through fear. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was tired, heartsick, disappointed beyond measure, but not afraid. If the only way I can be part of your lives is by allowing you to steal from me and abuse me, I said, then maybe it's better if I'm not part of your lives at all. She left then, slamming the door so hard the pictures on my hallway wall rattled. I sat down in my kitchen and put my head in my hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd just done. I had chosen myself over my children. I had prioritized my own well-being over their demands. I had set boundaries and enforced them, even when it meant losing the people I loved most in the world. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like grief. The next few months were a study in contradictions. On one hand, I felt freer than I had in decades. My money stayed in my bank account. My phone didn't ring constantly with new crises requiring immediate financial intervention. I could make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what everyone else needed from me. But I was also lonelier than I'd ever been. No family dinners, no grandchildren's voices filling my apartment, no sense of purpose beyond my own survival. I'd gained my financial independence, but I'd lost my family in the process. The legal proceedings moved forward slowly. Michael hired an expensive lawyer, with what money, I wondered, who tried to paint me as a confused elderly woman who didn't understand the agreements she'd signed. But the evidence was clear, the paper trail undeniable. He had forged my signature multiple times, created false documents, and systematically stolen thousands of dollars from me over the course of several years. In March, he finally agreed to a plea deal. He would plead guilty to identity theft and elder financial abuse, pay restitution for the money he'd stolen, and serve 2 years of probation. No jail time, which I was honestly relieved about. I didn't want to destroy his life, I just wanted him to stop destroying mine. The restitution payments were small, only a few $100s a month, and I knew I'd never get back most of what he'd taken. But it was something. More importantly, it was acknowledgement. Legal recognition that what he'd done was wrong, criminal, unacceptable. Jennifer, meanwhile, had cut off all contact. I didn't hear from her or Sophie for months. I wrote letters that went unanswered, sent birthday cards that were returned unopened. Judy kept telling me to be patient, that eventually they'd come around, but I wasn't sure I believed her. The hardest part was wondering if I'd made the right choice. Late at night, alone in my apartment, I would second-guess everything. Maybe I should have just continued enabling them. Maybe having family who used me was better than having no family at all. Maybe love really did mean never saying no, never setting boundaries, never prioritizing your own needs. But then I would look at my bank statement and see money still there at the end of the month. I would remember what it felt like to make decisions without having to consider everyone else's financial needs first. I would think about the woman I'd been before I became their personal savings account, and I would know I'd made the right choice. The turning point came in late spring. I was walking home from the grocery store, my arms full of bags, when I heard someone call my name. Grandma Rose? I turned around and saw Sophie standing on the sidewalk behind me, taller than I remembered, her face uncertain but not unfriendly. Sophie, I breathed, dropping my bags and opening my arms. She came to me slowly, hesitantly, but she came. We stood there on the busy sidewalk holding each other while people walked around us, and for the first time in months, I felt complete. I missed you, she whispered into my shoulder. I missed you too, sweetheart. More than you can imagine. We talked for an hour, standing right there on the street corner. She told me about school, about her friends, about the new laptop she'd saved up for with her part-time job at a local coffee shop. She was 17 now, old enough to understand that the adult relationships in her life were complicated, old enough to make her own choices about who she wanted to spend time with. Mom said you're mad at us, she said eventually. I'm not mad, Sophie. I'm hurt, and I'm disappointed, but I'm not mad. I love you and your mother more than life itself. That's never going to change. Then why can't things go back to the way they were? It was such a young question, so innocent and hopeful. She wanted her family back together, her world restored to its previous order. She didn't understand that the previous order had been slowly killing me. Sometimes, I said carefully, people have to change the way they treat each other before they can have a healthy relationship. Your Uncle Michael was taking advantage of me in ways that weren't fair or right. I had to stand up for myself. Mom says you were mean to him. She says you tried to get him arrested. I tried to get him to stop stealing from me, sweetheart. There's a difference. I could see her processing this information, trying to reconcile the loving uncle she knew with the criminal behavior I was describing. It wasn't fair to put her in the middle of this adult conflict, but her mother had already done that by cutting off contact. Can I still see you? She asked. Even if Mom doesn't want to? You can see me whenever you want, I said. I'm your grandmother, and nothing that's happened between your mother and me changes that. She started visiting me regularly after that, usually on Saturday afternoons when Jennifer was working. We would walk around the neighborhood, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes she would help me with small tasks around the apartment, organizing closets or helping me figure out how to use my new smartphone. These visits were precious to me, but they were also bittersweet. Sophie was clearly torn between loyalties, trying to maintain relationships with both sides of a family conflict she didn't fully understand. She would mention things Jennifer had said about me, negative comments and criticisms that clearly came from a place of hurt and anger. But she was also old enough to form her own opinions, and what she saw when she spent time with me was a grandmother who was happier and more relaxed than she'd been in years. I wasn't constantly stressed about money. I wasn't taking frantic phone calls about crises that required immediate financial intervention. I was just peaceful. You seem different, Grandma, she said one Saturday as we sat in my living room sharing a pot of tea. Calmer, somehow. I feel different, I admitted. Like I can breathe again. It was true. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was living my life rather than just surviving it. I had joined a book club at the community center. I had taken up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when all my free moments were consumed by family crises. I had even started thinking about traveling, maybe taking a bus tour to see parts of the country I'd never visited. These weren't grand gestures or dramatic changes, but they represented something profound, the reclamation of my own life, my own identity, my own dreams. Summer brought an unexpected development. Michael showed up at my door one evening in July, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen him. His business had finally failed completely, he told me. He was filing for bankruptcy, probably going to lose his apartment, didn't know what he was going to do next. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the old familiar tug. The urge to fix his problems, to offer solutions, to open my checkbook and make his pain go away. But then I remembered the forged signatures, the casual way he dismissed my intelligence, the years of manipulation and lies. I remembered the woman I'd been 6 months ago, stressed, broke, constantly worried about money, and the woman I was now. "I'm sorry to hear that, Michael," I said. "That must be very difficult for you." He looked at me expectantly, waiting for the offer of help that had always come before. When it didn't come, his expression shifted to confusion, then anger. "That's it? That's all you're going to say? Your son is about to be homeless and you're just sorry. What would you like me to do about it? Help me. Loan me some money to get back on my feet. Be my mother." "Being your mother doesn't mean being your personal bank account," I said quietly. "It means loving you enough to let you face the consequences of your choices." "Consequences? Mom, I made one mistake." "You made years of mistakes, Michael. You stole from me. You lied to me. You forged my signature on legal documents. You treated me like I was too stupid to understand my own finances. Those weren't mistakes, they were choices." He tried several different approaches over the next hour. Anger, guilt, manipulation, promises he had no intention of keeping. But none of it worked on me anymore. I'd developed immunity to his tactics, built up defenses against his emotional manipulation. Finally, he played his last card. "Fine," he said, standing up to leave. "But remember this moment when you're old and sick and need help. Remember that you chose money over family." "I didn't choose money over family, Michael. I chose self-respect over abuse. There's a difference." After he left, I sat in my living room as the summer evening darkened around me, thinking about what he'd said. Would I regret this choice someday when I was older and more vulnerable? Would I die alone, abandoned by the children I'd raised and loved? Maybe. But I also knew that the alternative, continuing to be their victim, their personal ATM, their scapegoat for every family problem, would have killed me in a different way. Slowly, quietly, but just as surely. Fall brought another surprise. Jennifer called me, her voice hesitant and unsure. "Mom? I was wondering if, maybe we could talk." She came to my apartment on a Tuesday evening, looking nervous and uncomfortable. We sat in my living room drinking tea, both of us unsure how to bridge the gap that had opened between us. "Sophie misses you," she said finally. "I miss her too. I miss you. Do you?" There was genuine uncertainty in her voice. "Because sometimes it feels like you chose being angry over being our family." I set down my teacup and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in months. She looked tired, older, worn down by single motherhood and financial stress and the burden of carrying grudges. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "do you really believe that asking not to be stolen from is the same thing as choosing anger?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Michael said you were being dramatic. That the loan thing was just a misunderstanding. Do you believe that?" Another long pause. I don't know what to believe anymore. You've never acted like this before. You've always been there for us, always helped when we needed it. Now suddenly you're talking about boundaries and abuse and I don't understand what changed." What changed? How could I explain to her that what had changed wasn't me, but my willingness to accept unacceptable treatment? How could I make her understand that I was the same loving mother I'd always been, but that I'd finally learned the difference between love and enabling? "What changed," I said slowly, "is that I realized love shouldn't hurt this much. Helping your children shouldn't leave you broken, stressed and wondering if you matter to them at all. Of course you matter to us. Do I? When's the last time you asked how I was doing without needing something from me first? When's the last time you visited just to spend time with me, not because you had a crisis that needed solving?" She couldn't answer that question, and I could see in her face that she was beginning to understand. We talked for 2 hours that night, the longest real conversation we'd had in years. Not Jennifer asking for help or me offering solutions to her problems, but an actual discussion between two adults trying to understand each other. She didn't apologize, not exactly, but she did acknowledge that maybe they'd been taking advantage of my generosity. She promised to think about what I'd said, to try to understand my perspective. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was a beginning. October arrived with news that changed everything. Michael's wife Sandra called to tell me that Michael had been in a car accident. Nothing serious, just a minor collision, but it had shaken him up badly. He was asking for me, she said. Wanted to see me. I found him in his hospital room, bandaged and bruised but alert. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital gown and the stark fluorescent lighting. "Mom," he said when he saw me, and there were tears in his eyes. "I thought I was going to die without ever making things right with you." I sat down in the chair beside his bed and took his hand. Despite everything he'd done, despite all the pain he'd caused me, he was still my son. Still the baby I'd rocked to sleep, the child I'd comforted through nightmares, the young man I'd been so proud of when he graduated college. "You're not going to die, Michael. You're going to be fine." "Am I?" "Because I feel like I've ruined everything. My business, my relationship with you, Sophie's respect for me. I don't know how to fix any of it." For the first time in our adult relationship, he sounded genuinely remorseful. Not manipulative, not calculating an angle, just, sorry. "You can start by telling the truth," I said. "About the loans, about the forged signatures, about all of it." He did. Sitting in that hospital bed, he told me everything. How the business had been failing for years, how he'd been borrowing money from anyone who would lend it, how he'd convinced himself that taking from me wasn't really stealing because he was family, because he intended to pay it back someday, because I wouldn't miss what I didn't know was gone. "I told myself I was protecting you from worry," he said. "But really I was just protecting myself from having to face what I'd become." It wasn't a complete transformation. One conversation couldn't undo years of entitlement and manipulation. But it was honest in a way our relationship hadn't been for decades, and it gave me hope that maybe, someday, we could find our way back to each other. The real test came a month later. Michael was out of the hospital and staying with friends while he looked for work. His bankruptcy had gone through, wiping out his debts but also destroying his credit. He called me on a Wednesday evening, his voice careful and measured. "Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything," he said. "But I have a job interview tomorrow, and I don't have money for bus fare. I was wondering if you could lend me $20. $20. Such a small amount compared to the thousands he'd taken from me over the years. But it represented something much larger, a test of whether he'd really changed, whether he was ready to treat me with respect instead of taking advantage of my love. "Michael," I said, "I'll give you the $20. Not lend, give. But I need you to understand that this is a gift, not the beginning of me resuming my role as your personal bank account." "I understand," he said, and for the first time in years, I believed him. He got the job, a position with a small construction company that didn't pay much but offered steady work and health insurance. He started making his court-ordered restitution payments, $25 a month that I knew represented a real sacrifice on his limited budget. More importantly, he started treating me differently. He would call just to check on me, not because he needed something. He would visit and help me with small tasks around the apartment, not because he was working up to asking for money but because he wanted to spend time with me. It wasn't the relationship we'd had when he was young, and it wasn't the relationship I'd dreamed of having with my adult son. But it was honest, and it was respectful, and it was built on love rather than financial dependence. Jennifer took longer to come around. She was still angry, still resentful of the changes I'd made in our family dynamic. But Sophie kept visiting, and gradually Jennifer began to understand that I hadn't rejected my family, I'd simply refused to be their victim anymore. The breakthrough came at Christmas. I was spending the holiday alone, by choice this time. Judy had invited me to join her family again, but I wanted to see if I could be truly content in my own company, in my own space, with my own thoughts. I was reading by the window, watching snow fall on the Queen's streets, when someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find Jennifer and Sophie standing in the hallway, their arms full of packages. "We brought Christmas to you," Sophie announced, grinning. "If that's okay," Jennifer added, her voice uncertain. "I know you said you wanted to spend it alone, but I thought maybe." I stepped aside to let them in, my heart full in a way it hadn't been for months. We spent the morning cooking together, preparing a small feast that none of us could really afford but all of us needed. We exchanged modest gifts. I gave Sophie a set of watercolor paints like the ones I'd been using, and she gave me a homemade scarf she'd knitted herself. Jennifer brought me a small potted plant, something alive and growing that would brighten my apartment through the winter. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jennifer told me as we sat around my small dining table. "About love not being supposed to hurt. I think maybe I've been hurting you without realizing it." It wasn't a complete apology, but it was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of understanding. We talked about boundaries that day, about the difference between helping and enabling, about what it means to love someone without losing yourself in the process. It wasn't easy, these conversations never are, but it was necessary. Michael joined us in the afternoon, bearing flowers from the bodega on the corner and an apology that felt more genuine than any he'd offered before. We were careful with each other, all of us aware that our relationships were fragile, that trust once broken takes time and effort to rebuild. But we were together, and for the first time in years, that togetherness wasn't built on my financial contributions or my willingness to sacrifice my own needs. It was built on mutual respect, on the radical idea that I mattered as much as they did. As evening approached and my children prepared to leave, Sophie hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," she whispered. "For standing up for yourself." Those words meant more to me than she could possibly know. To have my granddaughter, the person whose opinion mattered most to me, recognize that what I'd done was brave rather than cruel, it felt like vindication. The year that followed was one of gradual healing and careful reconstruction. Michael continued working, continued making his restitution payments, continued treating me with respect instead of entitlement. Jennifer and I slowly rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than financial dependence. There were setbacks, of course. Old patterns die hard, and occasionally one of them would slip back into treating me like an ATM instead of a person. But I had learned to recognize these moments and respond to them firmly but kindly. "I love you, but I won't be spoken to that way," became a phrase I used regularly. "I want to help you succeed, but I won't enable your irresponsibility," was another. Setting boundaries, I discovered, wasn't about being mean or withholding love. It was about loving myself enough to demand respectful treatment, and loving my children enough to let them learn from their own mistakes rather than constantly rescuing them from consequences. My life began to take on a richness I hadn't experienced in decades. I joined a knitting circle at the community center and made friends with women who valued me for my company rather than my checking account. I started volunteering at the local library, reading to children and helping adults with computer skills. I took a weekend trip to the Hudson Valley, riding the train through autumn landscapes that took my breath away. I stayed in a small bed and breakfast, ate meals I didn't have to cook, walked through orchards heavy with apples, and felt the cool October air on my face like a blessing. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt fully alive. The biggest change was internal. I stopped defining myself by what others needed from me and started thinking about what I wanted for myself. I bought books I was interested in rather than gifts for ungrateful relatives. I purchased a small television for my bedroom so I could watch whatever I wanted without negotiating with anyone else. I even splurged on a comfortable new chair for my living room, something that was purely for my own enjoyment. These small acts of self-care felt revolutionary after decades of putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. Spring brought an unexpected visitor. I was tending the small herb garden I'd started on my fire escape, basil and parsley and oregano growing in repurposed coffee cans, when Judy knocked on my door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her face bright with curiosity. In my hallway stood a woman about Jennifer's age, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase and wearing a nervous smile. "Mrs. Hartwell? My name is Lisa Chen. I'm a social worker specializing in elder financial abuse. I wondered if you might be willing to share your story." It turned out that Carmen, my lawyer, had recommended me as someone who might be willing to speak to other elderly victims of family financial abuse. Lisa was putting together a support group, a safe space where people like me could share their experiences and learn from each other. "Many people in your situation feel isolated and ashamed," Lisa explained as we sat in my living room. "They think they're the only ones whose children have taken advantage of them. They think it's their fault somehow, that they raised bad kids or that they should have been smarter about money." I knew that feeling intimately. The shame of having been fooled by people I'd trusted completely. The embarrassment of having to admit that my own children had seen me as nothing more than a source of funds. "Would you be willing to share your story?" Lisa asked. "Not the details, just the general experience. How you recognized what was happening, how you found the courage to stop it, how you're rebuilding your life now." I thought about it for a week before giving her my answer. Sharing such personal pain with strangers felt terrifying. But I also remembered how isolated I'd felt during the worst of it, how desperately I'd needed to know that I wasn't alone, wasn't crazy, wasn't a bad mother for wanting to be treated with respect. The support group met every Thursday evening at the community center. There were 8 of us that first night, 7 women and 1 man, all over 60, all carrying the invisible wounds of family financial abuse. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine. Adult children who had drained their parents' retirement accounts. Grandchildren who had stolen credit cards and forged checks. Sons and daughters who had convinced elderly parents to take out mortgages or loans, then disappeared with the money. But there were also stories of recovery, of people who had found the courage to say no, to set boundaries, to choose their own well-being over their family's financial demands. These stories gave me hope and validated my own journey. I became a regular at the support group, and eventually, I began sharing my own experiences. It felt strange at first, talking to strangers about such personal pain. But it was also liberating. For the first time, I was able to tell my story without being judged, without being made to feel that I was somehow at fault for trusting the people I'd raised and loved. One Thursday evening in late spring, a new member joined our group. She was younger than the rest of us, maybe 65, well-dressed but with eyes that held the particular pain of someone whose trust had been systematically violated by family members. "My name is Patricia," she said when it was her turn to speak. "My son has been stealing from me for 3 years, and I just found out about it last week." She told her story through tears, describing the same pattern of denial and exploitation that I knew so well. Her son had been using her credit cards without permission, had taken out loans in her name, had even sold some of her jewelry and told her she'd misplaced it. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "He's my only child. If I lose him, I'll have nobody." I looked around the room at the faces of people who had walked this same dark path, who had faced this same impossible choice between their financial survival and their family relationships. "Patricia," I said gently, "I understand that fear. I lived with it for years. But let me ask you something, do you really have him now? Not the relationship you wish you had, not the son you remember from when he was small, but the actual person he is today. Do you really have a loving relationship with someone who steals from you?" She couldn't answer, but I could see in her face that she was beginning to understand. "The hardest thing I've ever done was choose myself over my children's demands," I continued. "But it wasn't really choosing myself over them, it was choosing reality over fantasy. The fantasy that they would change if I just loved them enough, gave them enough, sacrificed enough of myself." "What if they never forgive me?" she asked. "What if they don't?" I replied. "What if you choose to respect yourself and they punish you for it? What kind of love is that, really? Love that depends on you allowing yourself to be abused isn't love at all, it's just a transaction." Those words surprised me as I said them. I hadn't planned them, hadn't rehearsed them, but they came from some deep place of hard-won wisdom. The group continued for months, and I watched Patricia make the same difficult journey I had made. She pressed charges against her son. She changed her locks and her bank accounts. She endured the same accusations of cruelty and selfishness that I had faced. But she also began to heal. Slowly, carefully, she started rebuilding her life on a foundation of self-respect rather than family obligation. Summer arrived with news that filled me with more pride than any achievement of my own. Sophie had been accepted to college with a partial scholarship she'd earned through her excellent grades and her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. She came to tell me in person, bouncing with excitement in my living room like the little girl she'd once been. "I did it, Grandma. I got in." I hugged her tightly, this remarkable young woman who had somehow grown up decent and kind despite being raised in the middle of so much family dysfunction. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Your parents must be thrilled." Her face clouded slightly. "Mom's worried about the money. Even with the scholarship, there are still expenses." "She's been talking about asking you." "No," I said firmly. "Absolutely not." Sophie's eyes widened. "But Grandma, it's for my education. Mom said you always supported our education." This was the test I'd been dreading. Sophie's college tuition, her future, her dreams. How could I say no to something so important, so worthy? But I also knew that this was exactly how the cycle started. One reasonable request, one worthy cause, one impossible to refuse demand. Before long, I'd be back where I started, broke and exhausted and wondering why my love was never enough. "Sophie," I said carefully, "I will support your education in every way I can accept financially. I'll help you research scholarships and grants. I'll proofread your essays and practice interview questions with you. I'll be your cheerleader and your advocate and your grandfather's substitute at every graduation ceremony. But you won't pay for it." "I can't pay for it, sweetheart. I don't have that kind of money anymore, and even if I did, it wouldn't be fair to you." "Fair to me? How is helping me pay for college not fair to me?" I sat down beside her on the couch and took her hands in mine. "Because if I pay for your college, you'll graduate thinking that's how family works. You'll think that love means never having to face consequences, never having to sacrifice for your own goals, never having to be truly independent. That's not true. Isn't it? Look at your father and your uncle. Both of them are middle-aged men who still expect me to solve their financial problems. Neither of them has ever learned to be truly self-reliant because I never let them fail. I thought I was helping them, but I was actually crippling them." Sophie was quiet for a long time, processing this. She was smart enough to understand the truth in what I was saying, even if she didn't like it. "So you're just going to let me struggle?" "I'm going to let you succeed," I corrected. "On your own terms, with your own effort, knowing that everything you achieve is yours because you earned it." She didn't speak to me for 2 weeks after that conversation, and those 14 days were among the hardest of my new life. But I knew I was doing the right thing, even when it felt cruel, even when it made me question everything I'd learned about love and family and sacrifice. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Sophie showed up at my door with a manila folder full of papers. "I've been researching scholarships," she announced. "Did you know there are hundreds of them out there? Academic ones, merit-based ones specifically for students whose grandparents survived the Depression. I looked through the applications she'd printed out, impressed by her thoroughness and determination. "This is amazing work, Sophie. I'm so proud of you for taking initiative like this." "I'm still mad at you," she said, but there was no real anger in her voice anymore. "But I also kind of understand what you meant. About earning things myself." She ended up receiving 3 additional scholarships that covered almost all of her remaining college expenses. More importantly, she learned that she was capable of advocating for herself, of solving her own problems, of achieving her goals through her own effort. The day she left for college, she hugged me tighter than she ever had before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me enough to let me do this myself." Those words were worth more than any tuition money I could have given her. Fall brought another anniversary, 2 years since that terrible Thanksgiving dinner when I'd first heard Michael's dismissive words about my age and intelligence. 2 years since I'd discovered the forged loan documents. 2 years since I'd started the long, difficult journey toward reclaiming my life. I marked the occasion quietly, sitting in my comfortable chair with a cup of tea and a photo album I'd put together. Not the old family photos that had once made me feel guilty and manipulated, but new pictures. Sophie at her high school graduation. Michael at his construction job, looking genuinely happy for the first time in years. Jennifer and me at the community center art show where I displayed one of my watercolor paintings. These weren't pictures of a perfect family. They were pictures of a real family, one that had been through crisis and emerged changed but intact. We loved each other differently now, more carefully, more respectfully, with clearer boundaries and honest communication. It wasn't the relationship I dreamed of having with my children when they were small. But it was real, and it was healthy, and it allowed all of us to maintain our dignity and self-respect. The phone rang as I was looking through the album. It was Carmen, my lawyer, calling with news that the State Attorney General's office was launching a public education campaign about elder financial abuse. "They want to feature your story," she said. "Obviously with your permission and with your identity protected. But they think your experience could help other families recognize the warning signs before things go as far as they did with you." I thought about all the people in my support group who had suffered in silence for years because they thought they were alone, because they didn't know that what was happening to them had a name and that there were resources available to help. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "If my story can prevent even one person from going through what I went through, it's worth sharing." The campaign launched the following spring. There were billboards, radio ads, and a website with resources for victims of elder financial abuse. My story was featured prominently, though they'd changed the names and some identifying details to protect my privacy. The response was overwhelming. Carmen's office received hundreds of calls from elderly people who had recognized their own situations in my story. Support groups were started in communities across the state. Adult children called asking for help understanding the difference between helping their parents and taking advantage of them. But the call that meant the most to me came from Patricia, the woman from my support group who had joined when her son was stealing from her. "I wanted you to know that I saw the billboard," she said, her voice strong and confident in a way it hadn't been when I'd first met her. "My story could have been up there too, but it's not, because I learned from your courage. Because you showed me that it was possible to choose myself without hating my child." "How are things with your son now?" I asked. "Better. Slowly better. He's in counseling, working to understand why he thought it was okay to steal from me. He's paying me back a little each month, not because the court ordered it but because he wants to make amends. It's not the relationship we used to have, but it's honest now. It's real." That conversation reminded me of something important. Healing is possible, but it requires everyone involved to be willing to change, to grow, to face uncomfortable truths about themselves and their relationships. My own family continued to evolve throughout that 3rd year. Michael was promoted to supervisor at his construction company, a recognition of both his skills and his newfound reliability. He started dating again, a woman named Carol who worked as a nurse and seemed to appreciate his honest, hardworking nature rather than expecting him to be something he wasn't. Jennifer finally finished her nursing degree, something she'd been working toward on and off for years. Having to fund her own education without my financial support had made her more focused, more determined to succeed. She graduated with honors and immediately found a position at a local hospital. Sophie flourished in college, making friends and discovering her passion for environmental science. She called me every Sunday, not because she needed anything but because she wanted to share her experiences with someone who cared about her. Our family gatherings were smaller now, less frequent, but infinitely more meaningful. We celebrated birthdays and holidays with modest gifts and homemade meals, focusing on spending time together rather than on expensive gestures or elaborate celebrations. Most importantly, our conversations had changed. Instead of the old pattern of crisis and rescue, we talked about our daily lives, our hopes and fears, our thoughts and feelings. I learned that Michael had always felt pressure to live up to some impossible standard of success, and that his business failures had been driven more by fear of disappointing me than by greed or laziness. Jennifer admitted that she had resented having to be the responsible child, always helping me manage the family's emotional needs while Michael focused on his career. She had taken my money partly because she felt I owed her compensation for years of unpaid emotional labor. These were painful conversations, but they were necessary ones. For the first time in decades, we were talking to each other honestly instead of playing the roles we thought we were supposed to play. Winter brought an unexpected opportunity. The community center asked if I would be willing to teach a workshop on financial literacy for seniors. Apparently, word had gotten around about my experience with family financial abuse, and they thought I might have valuable insights to share. I was nervous about speaking publicly, but I agreed. The workshop was held on a Saturday morning in February, and 23 people attended. Most were women, most were over 60, and many had stories similar to mine. Financial abuse by family members is one of the most underreported crimes in America, I told the group. It's underreported because we're ashamed. We think we should have been smarter, should have seen it coming, should have been better parents who raised children who wouldn't steal from us. I saw heads nodding around the room, recognition in faces that had carried the same shame I'd lived with for years. But here's what I've learned: it's not about being a bad parent or being stupid about money. It's about loving people so much that we make excuses for their bad behavior. It's about confusing enabling with helping, and sacrifice with love. I shared practical advice about protecting financial assets, recognizing warning signs, and setting boundaries with family members. But more than that, I tried to give them permission to value themselves, to see their own well-being as worthy of protection. The workshop was so successful that the community center asked me to make it a monthly offering. I found that I loved teaching, loved helping people understand that they weren't alone in their struggles. One of the most rewarding aspects was seeing people progress from victims to advocates. Many of the participants went on to help other family members or friends who were in similar situations. They became part of a network of people who understood that love and respect weren't mutually exclusive. Spring arrived with news that filled my heart with joy. Sophie was engaged to a young man she'd met in college, someone who shared her passion for environmental science and her commitment to making the world a better place. We're planning a small wedding, she told me over dinner at my apartment. Nothing fancy, just family and close friends. And Grandma, I want you to know that everything I've learned about relationships from watching our family has made me a better partner. What do you mean? I mean, I've learned that love doesn't require you to lose yourself. That healthy relationships have boundaries. That you can care about someone deeply without sacrificing your own well-being for them. These weren't lessons I'd intended to teach her, but they were perhaps the most valuable gift I could have given her, the knowledge that she was worthy of respectful treatment, that she didn't have to choose between love and self-respect. The wedding took place in June, a simple ceremony in the community center's garden. I wore a new dress, something I'd bought specifically for the occasion without feeling guilty about the expense. Michael walked Sophie down the aisle, his chest puffed with pride at being entrusted with such an honor. Jennifer did a reading from Maya Angelou that brought tears to everyone's eyes. But the moment that meant the most to me was during the reception, when Sophie pulled me aside for a private conversation. Grandma, I need to tell you something. When you refused to pay for my college, I was so angry. I thought you'd stopped loving me, that you'd become selfish and mean like Mom said you had. My heart clenched, remembering those painful conversations, the fear that I was losing her forever. But now I understand what you were really doing, she continued. You were teaching me that I was strong enough to achieve my dreams on my own. You were showing me that real love sometimes means saying no to things that seem loving but are actually harmful. You would have succeeded no matter what, Sophie. You're remarkable. Maybe. But I wouldn't have known I was remarkable. I wouldn't have known what I was capable of. The scholarships I earned, the skills I developed, the confidence I gained, none of that would have happened if you'd just written a check. She hugged me then, this beautiful, strong, independent young woman who had learned to value herself at least partly because I'd learned to value myself. As I watched her dance with her new husband later that evening, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. This was what healing looked like. Not a perfect family, not the absence of pain or conflict, but a group of people who had learned to love each other honestly, with respect and boundaries and genuine affection. The summer passed quietly. I continued my workshops, my support group meetings, my volunteer work at the library. I tended my herb garden and read books that interested me and took long walks through the neighborhood, appreciating the way Queens had changed and grown over the decades I'd lived there. My relationship with my children remained careful but loving. Michael and Carol got engaged, and he asked my blessing in a conversation that was both formal and heartfelt. Jennifer was promoted to head nurse in her department, a recognition of her competence and leadership skills. Most importantly, neither of them asked me for money. Not once, all summer long. This might seem like a small thing to people who've never dealt with family financial abuse, but for me it represented a fundamental shift. They were treating me like a person whose company they valued, not like a resource to be exploited. Fall brought an unexpected honor. The state's Coalition Against Elder Abuse presented me with an award for my work in raising awareness about family financial abuse. The ceremony was held in the state capitol, and both of my children came with me to watch me receive the recognition. "We're proud of you, Mom," Michael said as we drove home. "Not just for the award, but for the courage it took to stand up for yourself." I know it wasn't easy. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," I admitted. "But it was also necessary. For all of us." "I think about that sometimes," Jennifer added from the back seat. "About how different things might have been if you hadn't found your voice when you did. I think we all might have ended up much worse people. These weren't conversations we could have had 3 years ago. We'd all had to grow and change and face uncomfortable truths about ourselves before we could speak this honestly with each other." That evening, as I sat in my comfortable chair looking at the award plaque, I thought about the woman I'd been at that terrible Thanksgiving dinner when this all began. She'd been so beaten down, so convinced that her only value lay in what she could provide for others, so afraid of losing her family's love that she'd been willing to accept any treatment, no matter how harmful. I thought about her with compassion now, this earlier version of myself who had suffered so much because she hadn't understood that love and respect could coexist, that setting boundaries wasn't the same as withdrawing love. Winter brought news that completed the circle in an unexpected way. Patricia from my support group called to tell me that she was starting her own workshop series, specifically for adult children who wanted to understand how their financial relationship with their elderly parents might be harmful. "Your son Michael actually reached out to me," she said. "He wants to speak to the group about what it was like from his perspective, how he justified stealing from you and what finally made him understand how wrong it was." This surprised me. Michael and I had talked about his choices and their consequences, but I hadn't known he was interested in helping others avoid making the same mistakes. "He's nervous about it," Patricia continued. "But he thinks it might help other adult children recognize the warning signs in their own behavior before they cause the kind of damage he caused." I was proud of him for being willing to be so publicly vulnerable, to admit his mistakes in service of helping others. It showed a level of personal growth that I hadn't been sure was possible. The workshop series was successful, creating a space for honest dialogue between adult children and elderly parents about financial boundaries and mutual respect. Michael became a regular speaker, sharing his story with raw honesty about entitlement, desperation, and the rationalization that allowed him to justify stealing from the person who loved him most. But more than that, he became an advocate for other families dealing with similar issues. He started volunteering with a local organization that helped people understand the difference between helping elderly parents and taking advantage of them. Spring arrived with my 75th birthday, a milestone I celebrated quietly but meaningfully. Sophie and her husband drove up from college for the weekend. Michael and Carol brought homemade cake and flowers from their garden. Jennifer gave me a photo album she'd put together, chronicling our family's journey from dysfunction to health. We spent the evening on my fire escape, which I'd gradually transformed into a small urban oasis with plants and comfortable seating. The city spread out below us, lights twinkling in apartment windows where other families were having their own complicated, imperfect, but hopefully loving dinners. "I have something to tell you all," I said as the evening wound down. "I've been thinking about selling the apartment." The silence that followed wasn't the panicked, financial calculation silence of years past. It was thoughtful, concerned silence. "Are you having money problems, Mom?" Jennifer asked. "Because if you need help, no, sweetheart. Actually, for the first time in decades, I'm financially stable. The restitution payments, the money I'm saving by not constantly helping with family crises, even the small income from my workshops, it's all adding up. I'm okay." "Then why sell?" Michael wanted to know. "Because this apartment holds so many painful memories. Don't get me wrong, it holds beautiful ones too. But I think I'm ready for a fresh start somewhere that hasn't witnessed so much struggle." I'd been looking at senior living communities, not the institutional nursing homes I'd always feared, but real communities where active older adults could maintain their independence while having access to services and social opportunities. "I found a place about an hour north of here," I continued. "It's near the Hudson Valley, where I went on that trip that meant so much to me. It has a garden where I can grow vegetables, art studios where I can continue painting, and a library where I might volunteer." "That sounds wonderful," Sophie said, and I could tell she meant it. "But what about us?" Jennifer asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice. "How will we see you?" This question, asked without any undertone of financial concern or crisis management, meant everything to me. She wanted to see me because she enjoyed my company, not because she needed something from me. "You'll visit," I said simply. When you want to spend time with me, not when you need me to solve a problem or provide emergency funding. You'll come because you love me, and I'll be there because I love you. We spent the next hour talking about logistics, about how this move would affect our relationships, about what it would mean for family gatherings and holiday celebrations. But underneath all the practical concerns was something beautiful, the assumption that we would continue to be part of each other's lives because we chose to be, not because we were bound together by financial dependence or crisis management. The move took place in early summer. My children helped me pack, and we spent days going through belongings that held decades of memories. Some things went to charity, some to family members who wanted them, some to the small but much brighter apartment in my new community. The most symbolic moment came when we found the box of family photos I'd hidden away during the worst of our conflicts. Pictures of birthday parties and graduations, of holiday dinners and summer vacations, of all of us at various ages looking happy and connected. "These are beautiful," Carol said, looking through them. "Look how much love there is in these faces." And there was love, even in the difficult years. It had been complicated, tangled up with need and expectation and financial desperation, but it had been real. "I want copies of all of these," Sophie said. "For my own family someday." I made copies for everyone, and for the first time in years, I displayed some of them in my new home. Not as reminders of what we'd lost, but as evidence of what we'd built and rebuilt. My new community exceeded all my expectations. I joined the gardening club and started growing tomatoes and peppers alongside my herbs. I continued my art classes and even had some pieces selected for the community's annual show. Most importantly, I made friends, real friends who knew nothing about my financial history or my family struggles, who liked me for who I was rather than what I could provide. My children visited regularly, usually all together for Sunday dinner once a month. These gatherings were relaxed, focused on enjoying each other's company rather than managing crises. We cooked together, played board games, took walks along the nearby river. The transformation was complete but also ongoing. Healing isn't a destination but a journey, and we continued to work on our relationships, to navigate the challenges of loving each other within healthy boundaries. One Sunday evening in September, as my family was preparing to drive back to the city, Sophie pulled me aside for one of our private conversations. "Grandma, I want you to know that everything good in my life traces back to the moment you decided to stand up for yourself. Not just my college education or my marriage, but my understanding of what healthy relationships look like. You would have figured that out on your own, sweetheart. Maybe. But watching you choose self-respect over enabling showed me that love doesn't require self-destruction. That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." As I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with what I'd given them and everything to do with who we'd all become. That night, I sat on my small patio overlooking the community gardens, a cup of tea warming my hands, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this peaceful place. 3 years ago, I had been a woman so desperate to maintain her family relationships that she was willing to accept any treatment, no matter how harmful. I had defined my worth by my usefulness to others and my love by my willingness to sacrifice. But I had learned something essential: love without respect isn't really love at all. It's dependence, or habit, or fear dressed up in prettier clothes. Real love, the kind worth having, worth fighting for, worth rebuilding a family around, requires mutual respect, honest communication, and healthy boundaries. It requires seeing each person in the relationship as valuable in their own right, not just for what they can provide to others. I thought about my mother, who had visited me in dreams during the darkest period of this journey. I imagined her approval now, her satisfaction that I had finally learned to value the person she had raised, had finally stopped giving away pieces of myself until nothing remained. The stars were bright above my new home, brighter than they'd ever been in Queens. City lights had their own beauty, but there was something to be said for the clarity that came with distance, with perspective, with the peace of knowing you were exactly where you belonged. I raised my teacup in a silent toast, to the woman I'd been, who had suffered and endured and finally found her voice, to the family we'd been, complicated and painful and real, and to the people we'd all become, imperfect but honest, learning to love each other with dignity and tact. My story isn't unique. Across the country, elderly people are being financially abused by family members who justify their actions with love, with need, with the assumption that what belongs to parents automatically belongs to children. Many of these victims suffer in silence, convinced that they deserve the treatment they're receiving, that love requires unlimited sacrifice, that setting boundaries means withdrawing affection. But I want you to know, whether you're living this experience yourself or watching someone you care about go through it, that there is another way. Love doesn't have to hurt. Family relationships can be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. It's possible to maintain dignity while maintaining connection, to set boundaries while keeping your heart open. It's not easy. The people who have been taking advantage of you won't welcome your newfound strength. They may accuse you of being selfish, mean, ungrateful. They may threaten to cut you out of their lives if you don't return to being their personal bank account. But here's what I learned: if the only way you can maintain a relationship with someone is by allowing them to abuse you, then you don't really have a relationship with them at all. You have an arrangement, a transaction, a situation where your love is being used against you. Real love, the kind that nourishes rather than depletes, that builds up rather than tears down, is worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth rebuilding your entire family structure to achieve. Some relationships won't survive this kind of transformation. Some family members will choose to walk away rather than treat you with respect. That loss is real and painful, and I won't minimize it. But I will tell you this: the person you become when you start valuing yourself properly is worth any relationship that requires your diminishment to survive. The peace I found in my new community, the honest relationships I built with my children, the sense of purpose I discovered in helping others, none of that would have been possible if I'd continued to accept unacceptable treatment out of fear of being alone. Life has seasons, and my autumn years have turned out to be more beautiful than I ever imagined possible. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything is real. If you're living this story right now, if you recognize yourself in my words, I want you to know that change is possible at any age, in any circumstance, no matter how hopeless things might seem. You don't have to choose between love and respect. You can have both, but only if you're willing to insist on both. You are worth more than what you can provide to others. Your needs matter as much as anyone else's. Your comfort and security and peace of mind are not less important than your family's wants and demands. And if standing up for yourself costs you relationships that were built on your willingness to be taken advantage of, then those weren't relationships worth having in the first place. Have you lived through something similar? Do you know someone who's struggling with family financial abuse right now? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Please like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to help this message reach someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is share the truth about difficult family dynamics, to help others understand that they're not alone in their struggles. Your support means everything to me as I continue sharing pieces of my heart, hoping that my journey might light the way for someone else's transformation. Remember, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect by the people who claim to love you. Don't settle for less.